The fog rolled across the Yorkshire moors like the breath of dying men, and Eleanor Whitworth knew with bone-deep certainty that something was terribly wrong with Grimthorne Manor. She stood at the wrought-iron gates feeling the October wind of 1847 cut through her black morning dress while her gloved fingers traced the family crest etched into the cold metal. A raven perched atop a withered oak tree with roots that seemed to reach toward hell itself. 3 days earlier, Eleanor had been nothing more than a seamstress in London, surviving on stale bread and weak tea in a cramped boarding house until the solicitor knocked on her door with news that changed everything. Your great-uncle Aldrich Whitworth has passed and named you sole heir to the Grimthorne estate. The words had seemed impossible then and felt even more impossible now as she stared up at the towering Gothic mansion that rose from the moor like some ancient monument to human misery. Eleanor pushed open the gates and they screamed on their hinges with a sound that made her teeth ache. The carriage driver who had brought her from the village refused to go any further, and she understood why now as she walked up the cobblestone path that was cracked and overgrown with thorny vines that seemed to reach for her ankles with every step. The manor itself was a massive structure of blackened stone with tall windows that reflected nothing but darkness, even in the pale afternoon light. Gargoyles perched on every corner, their faces twisted into expressions of eternal agony, and their stone eyes seemed to follow her movement as she approached the main entrance. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. Eleanor hesitated with her hand on the brass knocker, shaped like a gnarled human hand, and wondered why her mysterious benefactor had chosen her of all people. She had never even heard the name Aldrich Whitworth before the solicitor spoke it, and yet, according to the family records, she was his only living relative. The door swung open at her touch, revealing a grand foyer that smelled of dust and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Candlelight flickered from somewhere deep within the house, casting dancing shadows on the walls that were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, all bearing the same penetrating dark eyes and sharp aristocratic features. The Whitworth bloodline stared down at her from their gilded frames, and Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Welcome home, Miss Whitworth. The voice came from the shadows near the grand staircase, and Eleanor gasped as a figure emerged. It was an elderly woman dressed in the black uniform of a housekeeper, her gray hair pulled back severely and her pale eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that was almost predatory. "I am Mrs. Grimsby," she said with a slight curtsy that seemed more mocking than respectful. "I have maintained Grimthorne Manor for the Whitworth family for more years than I care to count." There was something about the woman's voice that set Eleanor's nerves on edge, a quality that suggested she knew secrets that decent people should never know. "How did you know I was coming?" Eleanor asked. "The master's instructions were very specific," Mrs. Grimsby replied. "He told me you would arrive on this day at this hour, and that I was to prepare the blue room for your stay." She gestured toward the staircase where shadows seemed to gather and writhe like living things. "But first he wanted you to see the family gallery." Mrs. Grimsby led Eleanor through a corridor lined with more portraits, each more disturbing than the last. "Here is Lord Matthias Whitworth, who built this manor in 1623, she said, stopping before a painting of a man whose eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. He was said to have made a pact with dark forces to ensure his family's prosperity. Eleanor studied the portrait and felt a strange recognition, as if she had seen those features before. In dreams she couldn't quite remember. And this is his son Cornelius, who disappeared one winter night, leaving behind only his clothes and a room full of strange symbols carved into the walls. Each portrait told a story of madness, violence, or mysterious disappearance. The women all bore expressions of fear or resignation, while the men looked like predators waiting for their next victim. At the end of the gallery hung a mirror in an ornate silver frame. When Eleanor approached it, she gasped because her reflection seemed wrong somehow. Her face appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, and for just a moment she could have sworn she saw other faces behind her own faces, of the Whitworth ancestors, all staring back at her with hungry, desperate eyes. "Just a trick of the candlelight," Mrs. Grimsby said with a knowing smile, "though that mirror has always shown more than it should." Eleanor turned away from the disturbing reflection and noticed a locked door at the far end of the corridor. "Where does that lead?" she asked. Mrs. Grimsby's expression darkened. "The master's private study," she replied. "He left strict instructions that you were not to enter until tomorrow evening when the conditions would be appropriate." "What conditions?" But the housekeeper had already turned away and was walking back toward the main hall, her footsteps echoing in the silence like a countdown to something terrible. As night fell over Grimthorne Manor, Eleanor found herself alone in the blue room, which despite its name was decorated entirely in shades of deep red. The four-poster bed was draped with heavy velvet curtains, and the walls were covered in tapestries depicting scenes of medieval hunting parties, though the prey in these images appeared to be human rather than animal. Eleanor tried to sleep, but the house seemed alive around her. Footsteps echoed in the corridors above, though Mrs. Grimsby had assured her they were alone. Voices whispered behind the walls, speaking words in a language that sounded ancient and hungry. And always there was the feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes were studying her every movement, cataloging her weaknesses and planning something that her civilized mind refused to contemplate. Near midnight, Eleanor gave up on sleep and decided to explore. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor where moonlight streamed through tall windows, creating patterns that looked uncomfortably like reaching hands. The house was a maze of passages and rooms, each more unsettling than the last. In one chamber, she found children's toys scattered on the floor, as if their owners had simply vanished mid-play. In another, she discovered a dining room set for 12, with plates full of food that should have rotted decades ago, but appeared fresh and steaming. It was in the library that Eleanor made her first true discovery. Hidden behind a shelf of moldering books, she found a leather-bound journal with her great-uncle's name embossed on the cover. The entries began normally enough with discussions of estate management and business dealings, but as she read deeper, the tone became increasingly frantic. October 15th, 1847. "The dreams are getting stronger and I fear I cannot resist much longer. October 18th. I have done what was required of me and chosen my successor. She will come willingly, as they all do, drawn by the promise of inheritance and security. October 20th. The binding must be completed before the new moon. If I fail, the family line will end and all our sacrifices will have been for nothing." The final entry was written in a shaking hand and dated just 3 days before. October 25th. I can hear them calling my name from the mirror. The ancestors grow impatient and the price must be paid. Eleanor, forgive me for what I have done to you, but the bloodline must continue, and there is no other way. Eleanor dropped the journal as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. She had not inherited this estate. She had been lured here, chosen. And somewhere in this house of shadows and whispers, something ancient and hungry was waiting for her to fulfill whatever dark purpose her great-uncle had arranged. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the library made her freeze, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo with the weight of centuries. And as the footsteps stopped just outside the door, Eleanor realized with mounting horror that Mrs. Grimsby had lied about them being alone in Grimthorne Manor. Someone or something else was here, and it had been waiting for her arrival. The footsteps stopped, and Eleanor pressed herself against the library wall, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. Through the crack beneath the door, she could see shadows moving in the hallway, but they moved wrong, somehow flowing and shifting like liquid darkness, rather than the solid shadow of a person. Eleanor clutched the journal to her chest and tried to control her breathing, but the air in the library felt thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on her lungs. The door handle began to turn with agonizing slowness. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her decades ago. But the words felt hollow in this place where darkness seemed to have physical weight and presence. The door creaked open and cold air rushed into the room, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. Eleanor. The voice that spoke. Her name was not Mrs. Grimsby's. It was a man's voice, deep and cultured, with an accent that belonged to centuries past. When she opened her eyes, a figure stood in the doorway. He was tall and pale, with the sharp, aristocratic features she had seen in the family portraits, but his clothes belonged to an earlier era. A black frock coat and white cravat that should have marked him as a man from the previous century. His dark eyes held a sadness so profound it made Eleanor want to weep. "I am Aldrich Whitworth," he said, stepping into the library. Your benefactor, and I am afraid your destroyer. Eleanor found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. You are supposed to be dead. Death is a complicated matter for the Whitworth bloodline, he replied, moving to the fireplace where flames suddenly sprang to life without any natural cause. We are bound by obligations that transcend the simple matters of life and death. He gestured to a chair, near the fire, and despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Eleanor found herself sitting. The journal you hold contains only part of the truth, he said. The real story of our family begins much earlier. In 1623. My ancestor, Matthias Whitworth, was a desperate man. His wife had died in childbirth along with their son, and he faced the extinction of his bloodline. He made a bargain with something old and hungry, something that had been waiting in the spaces between worlds for exactly such an opportunity. Fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Eleanor noticed that Aldrich's shadow seemed to move independently of his body. The terms were simple. Aldrich continued, eternal prosperity for the Whitworth name in exchange for a price that would be paid. By every generation, each heir must willingly sacrifice themselves to feed the entity that sustains our line. And each heir must choose the next sacrifice before their own time comes to pay the debt. Eleanor gripped the arms of her chair. That is why. You brought me here, yes, Aldrich said. And for the first time his composure cracked, revealing centuries of anguish. I fought against it for decades, tried to find another way, but the hunger grows stronger with each passing year without the sacrifice. The entity will claim not just one life, but everyone who carries Whitworth blood. Every distant cousin, every child born of our lineage will die in agony. Eleanor stood abruptly, backing toward the window. I do not carry Whitworth blood, she said, was told I was your heir. But I never knew this family existed until 3 days ago. Aldrich smiled sadly. Your mother was Catherine Whitworth, she said. My brother's daughter who fled this place when she learned the truth. She changed her name and hid among common folk, hoping to break the curse through distance and denial. But blood calls to blood, Eleanor. And the entity that feeds on our sacrifice can sense Whitworth heritage no matter how diluted or hidden. As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Grimsby appeared. In the doorway, her kindly housekeeper demeanor had vanished, replaced by something predatory and ancient. She moved with unnatural grace, and when she smiled, Eleanor saw that her teeth were sharp and numerous, like those of some deep-sea creature. The preparations are complete, Mrs. Grimsby said in a voice that harmonized with itself, as if multiple people were speaking through her mouth. The mirror chamber awaits. Eleanor looked desperately between Aldrich and the creature that had been masquerading. As a servant, please, she whispered. There has to be another way. For centuries I believed the same thing, Aldrich replied. I studied ancient texts, searched for loopholes in the original pact. But Matthias Whitworth was thorough in his desperation. The only escape is death, and even death does not free us completely. He gestured to himself. Have been dead for 6 months yet. Here I remain trapped between worlds until the sacrifice is complete and the debt passes to you. The thing wearing Mrs. Grimsby's face laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking in a church. She thinks she can simply refuse, the creature said. They always think they can refuse until they see what happens to those they love, when the hunger goes unfed. With inhuman speed, it moved to the window and pressed its palm against the glass. The reflection showed not the moonlit moors, but a vision of London. Eleanor gasped as she recognized her boarding house, her few friends, the elderly woman who lived in the room next to hers. She watched in horror as shadows with too many teeth descended on the building. The screams carried through the glass as if the distance between Yorkshire and London meant nothing at all. Stop, Eleanor cried. Please stop. The creature smiled, and the vision faded. Choose wisely, little Whitworth, it said. Your life freely given, or the slow, agonizing death of everyone who ever showed you kindness. Aldrich moved closer to Eleanor, and she could feel the cold radiating from his ghostly form. The mirror chamber is in the basement, he said quietly. It is where the pact was first sealed and where each sacrifice must be completed. But Eleanor, there is something the creature does not know. Something I discovered only after my death. The original pact contained a clause, a way to break the chain permanently. Her heart leaped with desperate hope. What clause if an heir can face the entity, directly and willingly take upon themselves not just their own death, but the accumulated debt of all previous sacrifices they can destroy the pact entirely? The creature that had been Mrs. Grimsby snarled and lunged forward, but Aldrich raised his hand and ghostly flames surrounded Eleanor, protecting her, but the cost would be unimaginable. He continued, not just death, but the complete consumption of your soul. You would cease to exist in any form forever. No afterlife, no peace, just absolute nothingness. Eleanor looked between the two supernatural beings, her ghostly benefactor who had tried to save her by damning her, and the ancient hunger that wore a human face while it waited to feed. Outside the window she could hear whispers in the wind, the voices of every Whitworth who had died to maintain this cursed bargain. And somewhere in those voices she heard her mother's voice, calling her name, warning her, begging her to run. But Eleanor Whitworth had spent her entire life running from poverty, from loneliness, from a world that offered her nothing but scraps and false promises. She was tired of running. She looked at Aldrich, with eyes that had aged years in the space of minutes. "Show me this mirror chamber," she said. "Show me how to end this curse forever." The creature that had been Mrs. Grimsby threw back its head and howled with rage and hunger, and in that sound Eleanor heard the deaths of all the innocents who would die if she chose the easier path. The choice was no choice at all. She would face the entity, she would break the pact, and if the price was the complete destruction of her soul, then at least no other child would inherit this legacy of blood and shadow. Aldrich nodded with profound respect. "Very well," he said, "but know this. Eleanor Whitworth, what waits for you in the mirror chamber is not just an entity. It is the accumulated hunger and malevolence of 3 centuries, and once you enter that room there will be no escape, no mercy and no hope of survival." Eleanor straightened her shoulders and walked toward the door. "Then let us finish what Matthias Whitworth began," she said, "and let the Whitworth bloodline die with honor rather than continue in shame." Behind her the creature laughed, and the sound followed them down into the depths of Grimthorne Manor, where older, darker things were waiting to be fed. The descent into the manor's bowels felt like traveling. Backward through time itself, stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps led deeper into the earth, past walls that grew older and more primitive with each level. Medieval stonework gave way to rough-hewn blocks that predated Christianity in England. The air grew thick with the weight of accumulated years, and Eleanor could taste metal and something else on her tongue, something that reminded her of the copper pennies she used to place on dead men's eyes when she worked briefly in a morgue. Aldrich moved beside her, his ghostly form providing the only light in the oppressive darkness. The creature that had worn Mrs. Grimsby's face followed behind, making sounds that were not quite human, scratching and chittering like an insect trapped in human skin. "How many?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How many have died to feed this thing?" Aldrich was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. "One from each generation for 3 centuries, he finally said. "But the entity has grown stronger, with each feeding more demanding, more creative in its cruelty. My grandfather was allowed a quick death, a simple drowning in the manor well, but by my father's time it required more elaborate ceremonies. And when my turn came, it kept me alive for 3 days in the mirror, chamber feeding slowly, savoring every moment of agony." Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat. Why did no one try to break the pact before? "Some did," Aldrich replied. As they reached a heavy wooden door banded with iron, my great-aunt Cordelia attempted to burn down the manor with herself inside. She thought destroying the physical anchor might break the spiritual bonds. The creature behind them laughed. "We found her bones in the ashes, still screaming. Still burning fire cannot consume what exists between worlds." Aldrich pressed his hand against the door and it swung open, revealing a chamber that defied natural law. The room was perfectly circular, with walls of polished black stone that reflected no light. In the center stood a massive mirror, easily 10 feet tall, framed in silver that seemed to move and flow like liquid mercury. But it was not the mirror itself that made Eleanor gasp. It was what surrounded it. Hundreds of smaller mirrors covered every inch of the walls. Each one showed a different scene of horror. In one she saw a young man with Whitworth features being slowly flayed alive while something invisible fed on his screams. Another showed a woman drowning in a bathtub that had been filled with her own blood, and in the largest mirror directly across from the entrance Eleanor saw herself. But not as she was now. She saw herself as an old woman withered and broken sitting in a chair while phantom children played at her feet. Children who bore the Whitworth curse in their dark eyes. Children who would someday face the same choice she faced now. "Welcome to the heart of the pact," Aldrich said. "This chamber exists partially outside of time. The mirrors show not just what was, but what could be. Every possible future, every potential victim." Eleanor approached the central mirror, and her reflection rippled like water. As she drew closer, the surface began to clear, and she found herself looking not into a mirror but through a window, into a realm of absolute darkness populated by things that had never been human. At the center of that otherworldly space sat something that might once have been a man, but centuries of feeding on human suffering had transformed it into something else entirely. Its skin was translucent, showing the movement of things that were not blood beneath. Its eyes were holes in reality that seemed to pull at her soul, just by being observed, and when it smiled, Eleanor saw that its mouth contained not teeth but tiny screaming faces, the faces of every Whitworth who had died to sustain it. Matthias Whitworth, the entity, spoke without moving its lips. Its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, an echo in dimensions that should not exist. "Do you see what your ancestor bargained with? Do you understand the magnitude of his desperation?" Eleanor forced herself to meet those impossible eyes. "I see a parasite that has fed on my family for 300 years. I see something that should have been destroyed long ago." The entity laughed, and the sound shattered several of the smaller mirrors. "Destroyed, child. I am beyond destruction. I existed before your world began, and I will exist long after your son dies. Your ancestors' blood has given me purchase in your reality. A foothold in a realm rich with suffering and fear, but I hunger for more than individual deaths. Now I hunger for entire bloodlines, entire nations." The creature that had been Mrs. Grimsby stepped forward. Its human disguise was failing, and Eleanor could see its true form underneath. Something with too many joints and appendages that moved independently of any earthly anatomy. "The pact can be expanded," it said. "Instead of one Whitworth every generation, we could claim 100, 1,000. All it requires is your willing cooperation." Eleanor looked at Aldrich, who was staring at the entity with centuries of hatred in his ghostly eyes. "There is another way," he said, quietly. "The clause I mentioned, but Eleanor, you must understand what it truly means. The original pact was written in Matthias' blood on parchment made from human skin. It binds not just the living, but the dead. Every Whitworth who has died in this chamber remains trapped, serving as fuel for the entity's power. If you invoke the dissolution clause, you take upon yourself not just your own death, but the spiritual weight of every sacrifice that came before. Your soul will be stretched across 3 centuries of accumulated agony, and then it will be consumed entirely. No heaven, no hell, no existence of any kind." The entity leaned forward in its otherworldly throne. "Choose wisely. Little Whitworth, accept the traditional sacrifice and die once. Your death will fuel me for another generation, and your spirit will join your ancestors in eternal servitude. But you will still exist. Still be aware. Still be you in some diminished form, or invoke the dissolution and experience every death that has ever occurred. In this chamber, feel every moment of pain your ancestors endured, and then be erased from existence so completely that even I will not remember your name." Eleanor closed her eyes and felt the weight of 300 years of suffering pressing down on her. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see them, generation after generation of Whitworth men and women who had stood in this very spot, who had faced this same impossible choice, and who had chosen the easier path, the path that preserved some fragment of themselves while condemning their children to the same fate. But Eleanor thought of the vision she had seen through the window, the elderly version of herself surrounded by doomed children, and she thought of her mother, Catherine, who had fled this place and spent her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up. When Eleanor opened her eyes, they blazed with a determination that made even the entity pause. "I invoke the dissolution clause," she said. Her voice rang through the chamber with finality. "I willingly take upon myself the accumulated debt of the Whitworth bloodline, and I choose annihilation over continuation." The entity roared with rage that shook the manor to its foundations. But the words had been spoken. The choice had been made, and somewhere in the darkness between worlds, ancient powers that predated even the hungry thing in the mirror began to stir. Powers that had been waiting 3 centuries for someone brave enough to pay the full price. The mirrors began to crack. The chamber began to shake, and Eleanor Whitworth stepped forward to face the total destruction of everything she had ever been. For the first time in 300 years, the Whitworth curse was about to be tested, and in that, testing something far older than human civilization was about to discover that even the hungriest predator could bite off more than it could swallow. The moment Eleanor spoke the dissolution clause, the air itself seemed to scream. Reality bent and twisted around her as forces that had slumbered since the world was young awakened to witness an accounting 3 centuries in the making. The central mirror exploded outward in a shower of silver fragments that hung suspended in the air like frozen stars. Each shard reflected a different moment of Whitworth suffering, a different death, a different soul consumed. Eleanor felt the first wave of accumulated agony hit her like a physical blow. The pain of Thomas Whitworth, who had been the first to die, after Matthias' slow starvation in a sealed chamber, while the entity fed on his despair drop by drop. Her body convulsed as she experienced his death from the inside, felt his ribs pressing against his skin, tasted the metallic flavor of his own blood as he bit through his tongue to keep from screaming. But before she could recover, the next death crashed into her consciousness. Margaret Whitworth burned alive in 1689, while the entity savored every blister, every moment of agony as flame consumed. Her flesh, Eleanor could smell her own hair burning, could feel her skin cracking and peeling away. The creature that had worn Mrs. Grimsby's face shrieked in delight. Yes, it cried. Feel them all, every moment of suffering we have collected, every scream we have treasured. Death after death slammed into Eleanor with relentless force. Jonathan Whitworth drowned in 1712, his lungs filling with black water that tasted of despair. Beatrice Whitworth in 1745, slowly dissected while still alive, her organs removed, one by one and examined by invisible hands. Each death was complete. Each agony was total. Eleanor lived through them all, experienced every sensation, every emotion, every final thought. But something was wrong. The entity had expected her to break, had anticipated that the weight of 3 centuries would shatter her mind and leave her a gibbering shell. Instead, Eleanor seemed to grow stronger with each death she absorbed. Her spirit expanded to contain the suffering. Her soul stretched to encompass the pain, and, in the space between one death and the next, she heard voices. The voices of her ancestors, not screaming in torment as the entity had claimed, but whispering encouragement, lending her their strength. "We have been waiting," Thomas whispered, "waiting for someone strong enough to carry all of us." Margaret added her voice. "The entity lied about our fate. We are not trapped in torment. We are trapped in purpose, waiting for the one who could free us all." Eleanor realized with growing wonder that the dissolution clause was not about bearing suffering alone. It was about gathering the scattered pieces of her family's souls, about becoming a vessel strong enough to hold 300 years of Whitworth spirits, and then releasing them all at once in a blast of accumulated power. The entity in the mirror realm seemed to sense the change. "It's impossible." Eyes widened with something that might have been fear. "No," it snarled. "This is not how the pact works. You cannot turn our own power against us." But Eleanor was no longer listening to the creature. She was listening to Aldrich, who materialized beside her, his ghostly form blazing with renewed purpose. "The dissolution clause was never about destruction," he said. With dawning understanding, it was about unity, about gathering the entire Whitworth bloodline into a single focal point. Every soul the entity claimed, every death it savored has been stored in this chamber, and now you are calling them home. The smaller mirrors around the chamber began to crack and shatter from each broken, Surface, a ghostly figure emerged. 3 centuries of Whitworth men and women, all the victims of the entity's hunger, all the souls it had claimed and twisted to its own ends. They stood behind Eleanor now, an army of the wronged dead, their combined presence, filling the chamber with power that made the ancient stones tremble. The creature wearing Mrs. Grimsby's face backed away in terror. Impossible, it whispered. The pact binds them to us. They cannot act against their master. Eleanor smiled and felt the combined will of her ancestors flowing through her. You are not their master, she said. You are their jailer, and every prison can be broken from within. The entity in the mirror realm rose from its throne, its form expanding until it pressed against the boundaries. Between dimensions, I will not be denied, it roared. I will claim this entire world rather than lose my foothold in it. But as it reached through the mirror to grasp Eleanor, something extraordinary happened. The ghostly Whitworths moved as one. 300. Spirits united in purpose, they formed a barrier between the entity and Eleanor, their combined essence creating a wall of pure human will, and for the first time in its ancient existence, the creature found itself unable to break through. What is this? It demanded. This is family, Eleanor replied. This is love that survives death. This is the one thing you never understood. The power of sacrifice freely given, not for personal gain but for others. The entity thrashed against the barrier of spirits but could not pass. Its claws scraped against their combined essence like nails on glass. In its frustration, it made a critical error. It reached too far, extended too much of itself into the human realm. And in that moment of overextension, Eleanor saw her chance. She reached out with hands that blazed with ancestral power and grasped the entity's true form. The moment of contact was like touching the heart of a star pane beyond. Description flooded through her, but she held on, held tight, and began to pull. Not to drag the entity into the human world, but to pull herself and every Whitworth soul into the space between dimensions, into the void where the creature made its home. The entity realized too late what she intended. You cannot. It screamed. The void will destroy you, will unmake everything you are. Yes. Eleanor replied as she felt her physical form beginning to dissolve. It will unmake us all, including you. The chamber exploded, in light that was not light, in sound that was not sound, in the space of a heartbeat. Eleanor felt herself scattered across infinite dimensions, felt her consciousness stretched across the breadth of creation, and in that moment of ultimate expansion, she understood everything. The entity had not been lying about the cost of the dissolution clause. She would indeed be erased from existence, but she would not go alone. The creature that had fed on human suffering for millennia would die with her, and every Whitworth soul it had claimed would finally be free. As reality collapsed around them, Eleanor had one final coherent thought. She thought of her mother Catherine, who had fled this cursed place, who had hidden among common people, and lived a simple life, who had died peacefully in her sleep, never knowing that her sacrifice, her choice to break with family tradition, had made this moment possible. Because Catherine had lived free from the curse, her daughter had been born, clean unmarked by the entities, influence strong enough to bear the weight of 3 centuries, pure enough to destroy what seemed indestructible. In the last instant before annihilation, Eleanor smiled. The Whitworth bloodline would die with honor, and the world would never know how. Close it had come to becoming food for something ancient and hungry. The light faded, the sound stopped, and in the sudden silence that followed, absolute darkness claimed Grimthorne Manor, but somewhere in that darkness, freedom was finally beginning to bloom. 3 days after the light died at Grimthorne Manor, the world began to change in ways that no one understood in London. Mrs. Agnes Hartwell woke from a nightmare that had plagued her for decades. For 60 years, she had dreamed of drowning in black water while something invisible held her beneath the surface. But on this morning, the dream was different. The water was clear. The hands that had held her down were gone, and for the first time since childhood, she woke without the taste of despair in her mouth. Miles away in Edinburgh, Dr. James Pemberton set down his surgical tools with trembling hands. Since beginning his medical practice, He had been haunted by visions of his own hands cutting into living flesh, not to heal but to satisfy some terrible hunger. He had fought against these urges every day of his professional life. But now suddenly, inexplicably, the visions were gone. The whispers that had urged him toward darker purposes had fallen silent. He did not know why. He did not question the mercy. He simply wept with relief. Across England and Ireland and Scotland, dozens of people with Whitworth blood, however distant, however diluted, felt something shift in the depths of their souls. Children who had been born with inexplicable night terrors slept peacefully for the first time. Adults who had spent their lives fighting against cruel impulses found themselves free of the darkness that had shadowed their thoughts. Elderly men and women who had carried guilt for actions they could not remember suddenly felt absolved. The entity that had fed on the Whitworth bloodline had cast a wide net. Its influence had touched every branch of the family tree, however remote. And now with its destruction, that malevolent presence was lifting, like fog before the morning sun. But it was in the village nearest to Grimthorne Manor that the changes were most dramatic. Thomas Blackwood, the village blacksmith, had been having the same dream for 20 years. Every night he saw himself standing in a stone chamber watching as something unspeakable fed on human suffering. Every morning he woke with blood under his fingernails and no memory of how it had gotten there. But when dawn broke on October 30th, 1847, Thomas woke to clean hands and a mind free of shadows. The local priest, Father Benedict, had been tormented by visions of blasphemous rituals performed in his own church dark ceremonies, where the sacred was corrupted and innocent blood was spilled on holy ground. He had begun to question his own sanity, his own faith. But that morning the visions were replaced by something else, a sense of profound peace, of a great wrong finally being set right. When the villagers gathered to discuss the strange lights that had been seen over Grimthorne Manor. 3 nights before they shared more than curiosity. They shared relief, a collective lifting of a burden they had not even realized they carried. Young Mary Fletcher, who had been mute since birth, suddenly spoke her first. "Words I can breathe now," she whispered to her astounded parents. "The bad dream is over." But the most profound change occurred in London in a boarding house, where a young seamstress named Catherine Mills woke with tears on her cheeks. Catherine had never heard the name Whitworth, had never known that her grandmother had been born with that surname before marrying and changing her name. But she had spent her entire life feeling watched, feeling as though something hungry lurked just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. That morning, for the first time in her 23 years, Catherine felt truly alone in her own mind. The presence that had shadowed her thoughts was gone, and in its absence she discovered something she had never experienced before. Hope. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Grimthorne Manor, something else was stirring. The manor itself had not been destroyed in the supernatural conflagration, but it had been fundamentally changed. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the building like a shroud was gone. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been dark for centuries. Fresh air moved through corridors that had reeked of decay, and in the basement, where the mirror chamber had been, there was now only empty stone. No mirrors, no supernatural geometry, no doorways to realms that should not exist, just natural Yorkshire stone worn smooth by time and weather. The solicitor who had originally informed Eleanor of her inheritance arrived at the manor. 4 days after the strange lights had been reported, he had come to check on his client to ensure that the transfer of property had proceeded smoothly. What he found defied explanation. The manor was empty but not abandoned, clean but not cleaned. It felt like a house where people had lived happily for generations, where children had played and families had gathered around warm fires. There was no sign of Eleanor Whitworth, no indication of what had become of her. But in the master bedroom, he found a letter, written in a feminine hand on paper that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "To whom it may concern," it began. "The Whitworth bloodline has ended with honor. The curse that plagued this family for 3 centuries has been broken. I have willingly paid the price for the freedom of all who carry Whitworth blood, however distant. This manor now belongs to time and weather. Let it return to the earth from which it came, and let no one mourn for Eleanor. Whitworth, I go to my fate, gladly knowing that No child will inherit the darkness that once defined our name. The solicitor read the letter 3 times before it crumbled to dust in his hands, but the words remained burned in his memory, and when he returned to London, he found that his records of the Whitworth estate had vanished completely, as if they had never existed, as if Eleanor Whitworth had never been born. But across Britain, people who had never heard of the Whitworth curse were discovering new reasons to smile. Children were sleeping. Through the night, artists were creating beauty instead of being drawn to depictions of suffering. Doctors were healing, rather than being tempted to harm, and in a small village in Yorkshire, an ancient manor stood empty under the autumn sky, its windows open to let in light and air, its doors unlocked as if welcoming visitors. But no one came, because somehow everyone knew that the darkness which had once lived there was gone forever. The Whitworth curse had died with Eleanor, but the freedom she had, purchased with her soul, would echo through generations, touching lives that would never know her name, saving people who would never understand what they had been saved from. In the end, that anonymity was perhaps the greatest gift of all. Eleanor Whitworth had not sought glory or recognition. She had sought only to ensure that no child would inherit the nightmare that had defined her bloodline. And in that noble purpose she had found a victory that transcended death itself. Even annihilation could not diminish the purity of her sacrifice, or the magnitude of what she had accomplished in choosing love over survival. The world was brighter for her having lived in it, even if the world would never remember her name. 178 years later, a young historian named David Chen stood in the ruins of what had once been Grimthorne Manor, the Yorkshire Moors Preservation. Society had sent him to catalogue the remains before the land was sold to developers. What he found challenged everything he thought he knew about historical research. The manor had been reduced to little more than foundation stones and scattered walls, but the basement remained largely intact. And in that basement, David discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden beneath centuries of accumulated earth and debris was a chamber lined with broken mirror fragments. Each piece of glass was etched with names and dates spanning from 1623 to 1847, the Whitworth family genealogy written in silver and shadow. At the center of the chamber, David found a single intact mirror. When he approached it, expecting to see his own reflection, he saw instead a woman in Victorian dress. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair and eyes that held both infinite sadness and profound peace. Eleanor, he whispered, though he had never heard the name before. The woman in the mirror smiled and placed her hand against the glass from the inside. For a moment, David could have sworn he felt warmth against his palm. Then she spoke. Her voice came not through his ears, but directly into his mind. "The curse is broken," she said, "but the story must not be lost. Too many heroes die in darkness. Too many sacrifices go unrecorded. You will remember. You will tell others, and in the telling, my family will live again." David stumbled backward as understanding flooded through him. Somehow, impossibly, he knew everything: the 300-year curse, the entity that had fed on human suffering, the generations of Whitworth men and women who had died to sustain an ancient hunger, and Eleanor, brave, beautiful Eleanor, who had chosen annihilation over continuation, who had gathered the souls of her ancestors and led them into the void to destroy something that should never have existed. When David looked back at the mirror, it showed only his own reflection. But in his mind he carried the complete history of the Whitworth bloodline, every name, every face, every sacrifice. That night in his hotel room, David began to write. He wrote through the dawn and into the following day. He wrote until his hands cramped and his eyes burned. But he could not stop. The story demanded to be told. When he finished, he had produced a manuscript that read like historical fiction, too fantastical to be true, too detailed to be invented. David knew that no academic journal would publish his account. No historical society would accept such an outlandish tale. But he also knew that he could not let the story die with him. So he did something unprecedented in his careful academic career. He published the manuscript as fiction. He changed the names and dates just enough to protect himself from ridicule. But the essential truth remained. The story of a cursed bloodline, of an entity that fed on human suffering, and of a young woman who sacrificed everything to save people she would never meet. The book became a modest success. Readers found themselves drawn to its emotional authenticity, to the way it portrayed sacrifice not as glorious but as necessary, not as heroic but as human. But David knew the real victory was smaller and more profound. In coffee shops and bookstores, in libraries and living rooms, people were reading Eleanor's story. Her name was being spoken aloud, her sacrifice was being remembered, and somewhere in the space between worlds where heroes go when their work is done, Eleanor Whitworth was no longer forgotten. Years passed. The book found its way into the hands of a young mother named Sarah Collins. Sarah had been having nightmares since childhood, dreams of drowning in black water, while invisible hands held her beneath the surface. But as she read David's fictionalized account of the Whitworth curse, she realized something extraordinary. The nightmares were not random products of her imagination. They were inherited memories, echoes of a supernatural influence that had once touched her bloodline. Sarah's great-great-grandmother had been a Whitworth, a distant cousin, who had fled England in the 1840s to escape something she could never name. But Eleanor's sacrifice had reached across generations, had touched even Sarah's dreams. And in reading the story, Sarah finally understood why the nightmares had stopped on her 25th birthday, why she had woken one morning feeling lighter than air, why the darkness that had shadowed her thoughts had suddenly lifted. Eleanor had saved her children, had saved countless others who would never know they had been in danger. That night Sarah held her infant daughter close and whispered a name into the darkness. Eleanor Whitworth, a prayer of gratitude for a woman who had died more than a century before her granddaughter was born. And in speaking that name, Sarah ensured that the sacrifice would never be truly forgotten, that somewhere in the world there would always be someone who remembered, someone who understood, someone who carried the story forward miles. Away in Yorkshire, the ruins of Grimthorne Manor stood empty under the stars, but they were not abandoned. Visitors still came, drawn by stories they half believed, by local legends that spoke of strange lights and ghostly figures. Most left disappointed, finding nothing more supernatural than old stone and Yorkshire wind. But occasionally someone with the right kind of eyes, the right kind of heart, would catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. A young woman in Victorian dress standing among the ruins, her face serene, her purpose complete, and those lucky few would carry away more than photographs and memories. They would carry the truth. That heroism is not always rewarded with recognition, that sacrifice is not always honored with monuments, but that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones, the ones that save lives without fanfare, the ones that break curses without celebration, the ones that choose love over survival and ensure that darkness never has the final word. Eleanor Whitworth died to save people she would never meet, and lived on in the gratitude of souls she would never know. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest magic of all. Not the supernatural forces that had once haunted her bloodline, but the very human power of a story, well told, of a sacrifice remembered, of a name spoken with reverence in the darkness. The Whitworth curse was broken, but Eleanor's legacy, her courage, her love, her unwavering determination to choose others over herself, that would echo through eternity, touching hearts and changing lives. One reader at a time. One story at a time. One act of remembered heroism at a time, and in a world that too often forgets its saviors, that was perhaps the most precious gift of all. The promise that no true sacrifice is ever truly lost and no hero dies in vain, as long as someone somewhere remembers their name. The end.